We have had the advantage of this blend greatly. The Foundation for Economic Growth, as you know, is a think tank working on research-based policy advice. And we not only do webinars, we also do many other activities, including doing research, publishing research papers, policy notes. And these days, we are also actively involved in economic literacy, whereby every evening from 7:30 to 8:30, we offer a 1 hour talk on some or the other contemporary issue almost every day. Today, we are working on climate and growth. As you know, it's a very contemporary issue. And I was just mentioning that this issue has been discussed at length by Niti Aayog. And we had a 4 hour odd long seminar in our Delhi, where we discussed various issues about climate and finance. And Professor Stavins' presence in India in July was the pivot up there that was discussed, where he laid down lots of details about the impact of climate on growth. Given that, uh, given that seminar on December 19th, I have now been advised that why not I convert this as number one talk and then have 5 or 6 more talks on climate and finance, climate and growth. And that's exactly what EGROW is doing. We have actually all blocked Fridays till end of March, but I'll be rescheduling 1 or 2 and then take them, if not sequentially linear every week, but 5 or 6 we are dedicating to the book, which was released by Niti on December 19th, where I mentioned Professor Stavins has a beautiful, lengthy chapter. Before the end of the webinar today, I'll show you the picture of it, and if possible on website, then we can all share. To talk about this issue on climate and finance, the Boston Consulting Group also came out with a study about a month back, which was discussed at EGROW a fortnight ago, on what type of risks climate can cause to the banking industry. Unfortunately, all over the world, including India, climate risk has not adequately factored in the balance sheets of financial institutions. And that's the issue they have flagged. It was just fortunate that Professor Stevens had met me and he had agreed to do this webinar for us 6 months ago, and that's what we are seeing today. To discuss this important issue, we have Professor Surender Kumar, who's a professor in the prestigious Delhi School of Economics. He was the head of the department till recently. He has worked on these areas of climate finance and growth. And we have Professor Robert Stavins from Harvard Kennedy School, a place which I think on public policy and government policy, the best we have on this planet. I've been very fortunate to have been there. Professor Stavin is the A.J. Mayer Professor of Energy and Economic Development at Harvard Kennedy School. He is the Director, Harvard Environmental Economics Program and Director, Harvard Project on Climate Agreements. He is a University Fellow, Resources for the Future, Research Associate NBER, elected Fellow Association of Environmental and Resource Economics, Member Board of Directors, Resources for the Future, and Editor, Journal of Wine Economics. He was Chairman, Environmental Economics Advisory Board, US Environmental Protection Agency. He was lead author, second and third assessment reports, IPCC, and coordinating lead author, fifth assessment report. With this, I hand over the session to Professor Surender Kumar to conduct the proceedings further. Professor Kumar.
Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thank you so much. And it's great pleasure that today we have Professor Robert Stavins with us to discuss this, we can say, very contemporary and we can say very essential kind of topic which is the need of the hour. And as climate change question is concerned, as you are talking about, means this problem we can say it has been intensifying in all these successive reports. Situation is, we can say, from bad to worse. It's or alarming, that kind of situation we may find in that. That's the one side. But simultaneously what we observe that this world has to grow, especially the developing countries. There are aspirations. For example, in Indian conditions, we aspire to be a developed nation by 2047, when we will be celebrating our 100th anniversary of independence. And if we have to do so, what it implies that this per capita income, it will increase many folds. And for that purpose, we have to have infrastructure which will be, again, we can say, you can say 10 times more than what today we have. And in that way, even the urbanization, it's expected to be almost, the urbanized population will be more than double the US population of today. So in that way we have to grow, but the standard path of development, which is very energy intensive, and this energy mostly is coming from the fossil fuels. So that's why if we have to grow, we have to make a choice whether we can have this conventional growth path. If we are adopting that path, or we can say that is not available to us, so we need an alternate growth path given this urgency of the issue. And in that, along with these new technological changes which we have to adopt, for example, say this renewable energies, this energy transitions in this last decade or so, we can say there are fundamental changes. But there we also need the policy front on that. And we also need to, along with this, we can say this fossil fuel transitions, as this COP 28 we said that we have to transit to that, because all this transition is required, because we have to stabilize these temperature increases. Stabilizations requires that this is that as early as possible we try to have this net zero emissions. And there this role of policies, this carbon pricing, where we can say, or this regulatory eva- regulatory evaluations, those kind of things, and where we can say who we can have better than Professor Stavins. So with these initial comments, I invite Professor Robert Stavins to, yeah. So Stavins, floor is for yours.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kumar. I'm going to share my slide deck, which will take a moment for me to bring it up. So can you see that? Have I
Yes,
done
it's
that
fine.
properly? Yes, wonderful. So I'm delighted to be with you, and I appreciate your flexibility that you're willing to do this at a time of day so that it's actually well into the evening in New Delhi, and your flexibility is really appreciated with that. So I'm going to start by going from the science to the economics to the geopolitics of climate change in two ways. One is spatial and one is temporal. The spatial one is that greenhouse gases mix in the atmosphere, so the location of the emissions has no effect on impacts. In economic terms, in other words, climate change is a global commons problem. That means that any jurisdiction that takes action, whether it's a country as large as India or a state the size of California, that jurisdiction will incur the costs of its actions, essentially the costs of moving from coal to petroleum and natural gas to renewable energy to greater levels of energy efficiency. But the climate benefits are distributed globally. And therefore, for virtually any jurisdiction, the direct climate benefits it reaps from its actions are going to be less than the costs that it incurs, despite the fact that the global benefits may be much greater than the global costs. That presents, of course, a classic free rider problem. It's in the interest of each jurisdiction not to take action, but to benefit from the actions of others. And that's why international, although not necessarily global, cooperation is essential. Now, there is, as I said, also a temporal dimension that takes us from science to economics to politics and policy. And that is that greenhouse gases accumulate in the atmosphere. The half-life of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is over 100 years. Later, if I have time, I'll comment on methane, which is very, very different time profile. But CO2 is the major greenhouse gas, and the damages are a function not of the flow, the emissions at any point in time, but the stock in the atmosphere. And so the most severe consequences of climate change from emissions now are over a long period of time. But climate change policies and the costs of mitigation are upfront. That combination of upfront costs and delayed benefits presents a huge political challenge in democracies where the political incentive is to give benefits to voters today and to place the costs on future generations. The climate problem is asking politicians to do precisely the opposite. So together, the global commons nature of the problem plus this intertemporal asymmetry make climate change a very tough political challenge virtually everywhere in the world. Now, these challenges are particularly striking for India. India is a major force in the global energy economy. Energy consumption has more than doubled since the year 2000. This has been propelled both by growing population and by rapid economic growth. But of course, energy use per capita is well under half of the global average. Over 80% of India's energy needs, the last time I looked, were met by coal, oil, and solid biomass. Coal is by far the most important source of energy and has been critical for the expansion of electricity generation and for the expansion of industry. Oil consumption has grown rapidly due to rising vehicle ownership and road transport. And then biomass, primarily fuel wood, makes up what is a declining share of the energy mix, a declining percentage, but it's still very widely used for cooking, particularly in rural areas. So India is the third largest global emitter of carbon dioxide after China and the United States. But this is despite its relatively low per capita emissions. And importantly, because of coal, oil, and biomass use, particulate emissions, these are small particles, PM 2.5, that are less than 2.5 microns across that go deep into the lungs. So that means that there is also a major health issue here, which I will comment on later. Renewable sources of energy have begun to gain ground in India. Solar photovoltaics growth has been nothing less than spectacular, and the potential for PV development and penetration in the future is even greater. Now, trade-offs are inevitable and are best not ignored. The transition from fossil fuels to renewables will not be cheap, and it will not be easy. If it were either, it would already have happened. The cost of decarbonizing the electricity grid and the transport sector will be significant. But the cost can be reduced through judicious use of innovative public policy. Carbon pricing instruments such as cap and trade, which India has already adopted in limited ways, are one example. Improved pricing of electricity, including the use of smart metering where feasible, is another approach. Costs can also be reduced through judicious use of flexible instruments of the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015. The appropriate use of the flexibility inherent in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is key, and India could play a constructive leadership role by helping to define the parameters of Articles 6.2 and 6.4. If we have time at the end, I will comment on my concerns about the current directions of the use of Article 6 in the Paris Agreement. It should also be recognized that reducing coal and oil use bring tremendous health co-benefits that actually exceed local climate benefits. This is not just true for India, it's true for any country that is relying on coal and oil. So for example, in the United States, by my calculations, a policy that reduces the use of coal and moves electricity generation from coal to natural gas and renewables would produce huge monetized benefits, 94% of which would be for local health impacts through reduced PM 2.5, not for climate change benefits per se. Also, of course, addressing climate change can greatly reduce the long-run costs of adaptation by reducing the impacts of climate change. Now, economists obviously tend to favor carbon pricing, either carbon taxes or cap and trade. So why is that? Well, there are three reasons. They're not ideological. It's number one, feasibility, because no other feasible approach could provide meaningful emissions reductions in line with the Paris targets, for example, of stabilizing global temperature increases at 2 degrees C, or better yet, 1.5 degrees C this century. It's also the least costly approach because abatement costs are highly heterogeneous, and it is the least costly approach in the long term because carbon pricing provides incentives for carbon-friendly technological change. So carbon pricing may be necessary in large, complex economies, but it will not be sufficient because there are other market failures that essentially get in the way of those price signals. One is the well-known principal agent problem, for example, of energy efficiency investments in renter-occupied properties, and the other is the public good nature of information spillovers. Now, in terms of the worldwide status of carbon pricing, we now have cap and trade systems in a number of jurisdictions in the world. This is not all of them. There are about 30 of them, but these are the most important ones. You can see the stringency varies, and we know the stringency varies because the price of allowances, the market price of allowances, varies from about $100 a ton in the European Union to something like $20 to $28 a ton in the Korean system, and also, for that matter, in the new Chinese system. There are also carbon and related energy taxes in many jurisdictions, about an equal number. I don't give the dollar amount of the taxes here because many of these are not carbon taxes per se, but are energy taxes, and they have lots of exemptions built in for favored domestic industries. But we can see these on a graph in order to understand which is most important right now. And on the horizontal axis, I have the scope of the system, the number of tons of emissions that are covered by the individual system. And then on the vertical axis is the carbon price, either the level of the tax or the market price of allowances from trading. And then the cap and trade systems, or the emissions trading systems, are in green and the taxes are in blue. And there are about equal numbers of the two systems. But as you can see, there's more green than there is blue. Some carbon taxes are at much higher levels than cap and trade. The outlier is Sweden, but other countries in Northern Europe stand out. But if you combine the stringency, the price, with the scope, the coverage, you multiply the two and look at the size of the rectangles, then clearly cap and trade is more important in application. I'm not saying that it's going to be in the future, but that it is as of now. In fact, this actually understates the importance because this is using an earlier price of the European Union emissions trading system. Altogether, this amounts to about 20% of global CO2 equivalent emissions. Now, China accounts for 30% of global emissions. If China's national emissions trading system, which has just been launched, eventually regulates half of its emissions, which is what they say it will do, then this will almost double the global coverage of carbon pricing policies. So what are the consequences of a carbon pricing policy? Well, I could look at it, first of all, for the fossil fuels. The greatest impacts globally will be on coal due to the high carbon content. And I'm thinking of its use for electricity generation, not metallurgical coal, but thermal coal. Immediate impacts on electricity dispatch, long-term impacts on investment in new capacity, and long-term impacts on the retirement of existing capacity. Then there's natural gas, where the impacts are smaller because of the lower carbon content. But although the gas is being priced and therefore discouraged, we could actually experience and anticipate experiencing a demand increase in the short term due to substitution of natural gas for coal. But the likely effects of the carbon pricing as it exists in most parts of the world are small compared with the effects we've already experienced, for example, in the United States, due to opening up of unconventional sources of natural gas due to the combination of two technologies, horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, otherwise known as fracking, which has opened up much lower cost sources of natural gas. So we saw the natural gas price drop in the US and a tremendous amount of substitution of gas for coal. And then there's oil. Here, the potentially significant impacts will be muted in the short term because there are limited substitutes for liquid fuels in the transportation sector. Of course, this difficulty is most striking in air transport, but it also exists in ground transport. In other words, there's relatively high marginal CO2 abatement costs. So a cost-effective portfolio in the short term would actually target electricity. It probably wouldn't target oil. It wouldn't target transportation sector. But increasing penetration of electric vehicles, we're seeing this in many parts of the world. It's very prominent in China. The growth of biofuels, agricultural waste, used cooking oil, and greater fuel efficiency mean that there will be a demand for the petrol demand may actually decline after 2026 or so. Now, this will be muted by growing demand for petrochemicals and, for that matter, in the agricultural sector. The economic impacts will vary across sectors and regions. Bad news for coal, even in the short term, mixed for natural gas, muted for oil, but unambiguously good news for renewables and possibly for nuclear power. There are political constraints, obviously, there in the United States and in Europe. In other sectors, climate policies increase energy costs. So a simple rule of thumb is that they're bad news for sectors that use energy, but that's all sectors. However, we should take note of the fact that these can be good news for sectors that produce energy consuming durable goods. So for example, Boeing Aircraft Company, because of the fact that when the price of jet fuel goes up, there is demand for the latest generation of Boeing aircraft, which are more fuel efficient. And therefore, it's particularly bad news for consumers of those same energy consuming durable goods. And that could be American Airlines, or it could be Air India. Now, quickly, let me compare carbon taxes and cap and trade. They're not the same, but they're much more similar than many people think. There's agreement from economists that they will be essential for long-term meaningful climate change policy, but there's less agreement regarding the specific policy instrument, carbon tax or emissions trading. So which approach will be better, superior in terms of key criteria, including but not limited to cost effectiveness, efficiency, and distributional equity? So I've written about this in a paper which you can download from my website for free, The Relative Merits of Carbon Pricing Instruments, Taxes versus Trading. Now, one conclusion of that paper, among others, is that the specific design of carbon taxes and cap and trade can actually be more consequential than the choice between the two instruments. Indeed, there's a continuous spectrum from, on the one hand, a pure carbon tax, a simple carbon tax, to a very simple cap and trade system. And many of the systems in the world are a hybrid of the two. So the systems are perfectly equivalent in terms of their incentives for emissions reductions, the aggregate abatement costs, their effects on competitiveness. They're nearly equivalent in terms of the possibilities of raising revenue, and they're similar in terms of their effects on regulated firms and the distributional impacts. It depends upon design. There are some distinctions in terms of transactions costs. There are subtle differences in terms of performance in the presence of uncertainty. And there are also subtle differences in terms of the possibilities of linking across jurisdictions. But there are significant differences in terms of carbon price volatility, interactions with complementary policies, market manipulation, complexity, and administrative requirements. I'm flying through this very quickly, but in Q&A, if you're interested in talking about any of these, I'm happy to do that. So one question is whether carbon pricing can be made more politically acceptable. One way is to phase in the taxes or the caps gradually over time. Another is to earmark the revenues for specific purposes, including for fairness purposes, with rebates or the targeted to low income and other particularly burdened constituencies. There can also be better economic design of non-pricing instruments, but in the long term, research ought to continue. I think I'm going to wrap up by commenting on the importance of methane. So methane as because it's something I'm working on now, and it got a lot of attention at COP28 in Dubai. So methane is emitted in much smaller quantities than CO2, so it's gotten much less attention. The radiative forcing of a unit, in other words, a molecule of methane, is much, much greater than the radiative forcing of a molecule of CO2. On the other hand, methane stays in the atmosphere for a much shorter period of time. So whereas CO2 has a half-life in the atmosphere of over 100 years, over 12 to 18 or 20 years, all the methane that's emitted at a point in time is no longer in the atmosphere. So if we look over a 20-year horizon, methane is actually 80 times as important per unit as carbon dioxide. If we look over a 100-year time period, then methane per unit is 20 times more important than carbon dioxide. So that means that in the short term, a great deal can be accomplished by reducing methane emissions. So at Harvard, we have a new multidisciplinary initiative that I'm directing. It's Harvard-wide. It's titled Reducing Global Methane Emissions. The goal is to achieve meaningful and sustained progress in methane emissions reductions through research and in fact effective engagement with key stakeholders around the world, and then to deliver information that can facilitate the design and implementation of new methane policies and programs. Like I said, we have 20 senior faculty members working on this, everything from the natural sciences to Harvard Business School. We build on satellite-based measurement and attribution of emissions, identify technologies that can best reduce emissions, carry out economic and decision science research to design better public policy, identify legal and regulatory opportunities and constraints for methane emissions reductions, define and address key political issues that are constraining, define roles that business can play in reducing methane emissions. We're also undertaking an historical examination of activity, and then finally identify key international and multilateral opportunities for and constraints to reducing methane emissions. In the first year, we started with a focus on the oil and gas sector in the United States, but we're moving quickly in the second and third year of the project into landfills and agricultural sources, which are both livestock and rice paddies, and moving beyond the United States into other countries. Now that leads me to conclude by bringing together the thinking about methane with what I talked about at the beginning, and that's using greenhouse gas markets. So how about using greenhouse gas markets for reducing methane emissions? I was asked to talk about this in Dubai, and here are the slides I used when I was in Dubai to talk about it. And I said there's good news and bad news, so the promise and the peril. There's a precedent from the Kyoto Protocol, perhaps. Article 17 was emissions trading, but it was very poorly designed. And so it had no effects, as I wrote in 1999, that it would not have effects. There was the clean development mechanism, but that brings up this huge problem of additionality when using emission reduction credit systems. The Paris Agreement has Article 6, and there are 3 potential levels of action. There are different policy instruments in different countries. Countries then form a linkage agreement that has nothing to do with Paris. Once they form a linkage, then there can be private sector trading of emissions across international boundaries, as there are between the EU and for example, Switzerland, as there will be between the EU and the United Kingdom, as there are between California and Quebec. Now, none of that's about the Paris Agreement, but that such linkage and trading can be facilitated and encouraged by Article 6, in particular Article 6.2, because this is an accounting mechanism that can encourage linkage and can prevent double counting. Unfortunately, Article 6.2 is going in the direction of being treated like Article 17 of country-country trading, in which case there will be little use and a lack of success. But just as problematic is that some projects seem to be moving into 6.2 emission reduction credits programs. These don't belong in 6.2, they belong in 6.4. And then the problems of emissions reduction credit systems like the former clean development mechanism will infect 6.2. So Article 6 can be viewed as facilitating greenhouse gases trading. In other words, intergrass trading is theoretically possible. But how to measure CO2 equivalent for the trading? Well, if you could use a 100-year time horizon, you could use a 20-year to 10 to 20-year time horizon. You're going to get a very different calibration for intergas trading. The economist's answer is to use the ratio of the present discounted value of damages over an infinite horizon. as the trading ratio. And this result is actually similar to the 100-year horizon. So another approach that I will close with is another approach that could be used that is based more on a carbon tax, and that's a methane fee. And we have that in new legislation in the United States, or the model of the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, about which I'm sure there is much concern in India, could be adopted. And within our project, we have some scholars, Catherine Wolfram from MIT, Kimberly Klossig from UCLA, who are working on a US-EU methane border adjustment mechanism, and you can also read about that at our website. There are abundance of other topics I could address. One example, of course, would be what happened at COP28 in Dubai this month. I just published a long essay on that at my blog. So my suggestion is that I won't say anything further. We'll move to questions and discussion. I'll say thank you, and I'll remind you that if you would like more information on anything I've said or anything I haven't said, the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements, the Harvard Environmental Economics Program, my own website, my blog, or you can follow me on Twitter. If you would like to be to subscribe to any of these or to be on our distribution list, just send me an email. I'm at robert_Stavins@harvard.edu, and give me your email address, your contact information, and we will enroll you immediately. So with that, I will stop sharing.
Yeah. So thank you, Professor Stavins, for this comprehensive, fantastic talk. And of course, we can say this carbon pricing, or you can say this pricing of the emissions, that may be one of the major instrument to handle this problem. And before opening the floor for questions, just a few comments. Means if we take the case of India, and if we are talking about this energy transitions through pricing of the emissions, there, if we see that in Indian condition, regionally, we can say this coal that's basically concentrated more in central and east India, and poverty is also concentrated in that area. So that is major source of the livelihood in these regions. But on the other sides, this we can say the green energy or renewable energy, that's much more, we can say, in the southern and western
Yes,
India. So that's
yes.
why this regionally distributional questions also arise. Similarly, at the global level, if we try to see that, like in the 70s, this oil was used as a weapon for the geopolitics. Similarly, as renewable energy is concerned, this main components of the energy, renewable energy, like these rare minerals, they are concentrated in some of the countries. So what that may be used later on as weapons in this geopolitics. So this substitutability will be very kind of difficult situations. So with some means, as the time will allow, you may like to comment on that. And now we can open the floor for the questions.
So let me,
Yeah.
before you go to other questions, let me comment on what you just said, because it's very important. In terms of distributional considerations within India, the important thing is that either a carbon tax or a cap and trade system with auctioned allowances produces tremendous revenue for the government. And the government then can target that revenue to, as I said, particularly disadvantaged communities. So, for example, in the United States, coal is mined in Appalachia. Appalachia is exceptionally poor. Appalachia in the United States is our own little developing country within one of the richest countries in the world. It's very poor and very little mobility. So that's where the revenue should be targeted. In terms of the international dimensions, the value of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is a way of essentially subsidizing emissions reductions in developing countries, subsidizing them by finance from the rich countries in the world. Essentially doing that in the case of Article 6.2 through foreign direct investment. And I see that as a way in which you can have both cost effectiveness and international distributional equity. I mean, even if one doesn't care about fairness, the fact that a fundamental aspect of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the requirement for common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And that's fundamental. So nothing is going to happen in international cooperation that doesn't give attention to distributional equity internationally.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so now we can invite questions. So, Dr. Chan Singh, people can put in the chat box or?
Yes, they can put in the chat box, but before we go there, I just wanted to show the volume to the professor,
Oh,
which has
thank you.
just been released. Here it is. It
Oh,
is on
yes.
the web also. I'll send you, Professor, the link on the web.
Oh,
This
good.
is the
Send me the link.
volume.
Good.
Thank
I
you.
will send you the link. And we have your write-up on page 6. And we also have the picture, big picture up there.
Oh, nice.
It's
Yes,
come
I
out very
remember
nice.
that.
It come out very nice.
Yeah, that was
And
a
I would,
wonderful conference in New Delhi. That was really
yes,
excellent.
absolutely. And I think
I
it was
learned a
July
great deal.
28, July 28 to 29, and that's where I met you. Now, a quick question, and maybe if it is not possible, I'll be happy to uh, listen that too. We are planning next Friday. Niti does the presentation. Manjeev Puri is the discussant. Would you, and this report is being discussed. This report is being
Oh,
presented at
really?
EGROW. Yeah. So would you like to chair that session? We can time it according to your convenience.
I don't think I can share it, but if you send me a link after you decide the time, if it's, I have a lot going on that Friday, so I can try to attend. Just send me the link.
Sure. Sure. So if you are willing to attend, we'll put it a little late. Otherwise, we were planning to do it 5 to 6, but I think if you are
Oh, you
planning to
should do
attend,
it.
we'll.
You should do it. You should do it when it's convenient for you. You already made this one inconvenient for you and
No,
convenient
no.
for me.
You,
So I don't want you to do
Professor,
that again.
Professor, do you notice there are 92, there were 92 people, even now there are 91 people here. So
Yes.
we are all here to learn, and we are so excited that we have experts like you speaking to us. Okay,
Well, I'm
now I have a.
delighted to be here.
And by the way, there are generally people from 5 different countries who are here: Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and many a times people from UK join. So
I
five
see.
different countries are on an average attending these seminars. Okay, now I have a quick question for you, Professor. This issue has been coming up in India in discussions repeatedly. And one of the issues, there are two issues. One of the issues is that the 100 billion aid or 100 billion fund, which had to be
Yeah.
created for the climate finance, doesn't seem to be happening. And my thought was, what was the scientific calculation of that 100 billion? To me, when I look at the financial world and I look at the implications and the transition that would be required, the expenditure would be much more than that. So I was wondering if you would know how that 100 billion got computed. The
So
second question,
that 100 billion was not a result of a scientific or an economic analysis. It was because it was a round number. It was a political determination at the annual conference of the parties that took place in Copenhagen when Secretary Hillary Clinton was leading the U.S. delegation. And much to the surprise of the White House, she agreed to this $100 billion number. They didn't know she was going to do that, but that's what happened. So the interpretation of most countries was that the $100 billion, which has been achieved now, by the way, just as of about a month ago, they finally gotten there. Much too late,
Uh-huh.
obviously. It was supposed to be in 2020. The interpretation of many countries was that that $100 billion was for mitigation of emissions in developing countries, for abatement. Other countries, and particularly the United States, saw that as adaptation, although there is a separate adaptation fund under the Paris Agreement. However, what's happened most recently is something that's really quite different, and that's the loss and damage fund. So the loss and damage fund is for after the fact. It's not to prevent damages. It's not for adaptation, which is to prevent damages. The loss and damage is essentially compensation for after damages take place. And that was a fund was created last year at COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt. And this year, funding came in, a very large amount of funding that's now come up to about $700 million. Now, that's got a lot, so it's almost $1 billion. Now, that's a large amount of money. However, it's very, very small compared to what the demand side will be for damages. If you think about the estimate of just the Pakistani floods 2 years ago and the damages in the order of $30 billion, then eventually the demand side for the loss and damage fund is not going to be in the millions or billions. It's going to be in the trillions. So the current commitment is less than 1%. In fact, it's about 0.2% of what the eventual demand will be. So things are going in the right direction, but they have a very long way to go.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a very good explanation, learning for us. The other thing, Professor, the thought is when we talk about the gas emissions and the methane, one thought that repeatedly happens is that this has an implication on development and growth. And when we had a challenge on Russia-Ukraine war, and when we had a challenge on energy, there are countries in the West who did not even wink and went back to the coal production, which is extremely polluting. So therefore, the thought is, how committed is the world to this, and including the advanced countries, which have a better wherewithal to find alternatives?
So I think it's fair to say that the European Union and the countries of the European Union are very committed to this. They have more ambitious climate policies in place, implemented, than anywhere else in the world. New Zealand, for the most part, has been quite committed, but it varies with politics because, in democracies, administrations change from right to left to right to left. Likewise in Australia. And I would say the same thing about the United States. The current administration is very serious about climate change. They put in place with the Inflation Reduction Act by far the most ambitious climate policy there's ever been in the US. But, if the government changes a year from now, because there is going to be a general election for the presidency, then that will change, and the U.S. will the Republicans will abandon any climate policy they can. So, you're in the world's largest democracy. I'm in one of the world's other democracies. That's the problem with democracy. It's a lot easier in China where they can decide at the top what they want to do and just do it. In a democracy, that's not possible. But I prefer democracy, nevertheless.
Yes.
We all do. We
Yeah.
all do. Professor
So,
Surender, back to you.
so let's take to the questions. And there are some questions, 6, 7 questions. So out of that, whatever you like to take, you take that. I just read out all them.
I'll just start at the top. These came in chronological order. Um,
Yes.
Satya Singh said not useful for developing countries like India. I guess I have two comments on that. One is that I'm not going to say what any other country should do. I'm referring to large complex economies. Um, but as I've said, India has already used emissions trading on a somewhat experimental basis at the state level, not the national level. So there may be possibilities. Also, it's a way of raising revenue for government, but I'm not pushing policies for any country other than my own. Um, and then Mr. I don't know if it's Mr. or Ms. Roy. How do we connect the challenges faced by developing countries like the U.S. with the challenges on climate change that are faced by developing countries like India? That's a very good question, and I think that's really where Article 6 of the Paris Agreement comes in. It's also where the loss and damage fund comes in. That's part of the Paris Agreement. It's also where the adaptation fund comes in. That's part of the Paris Agreement. Um, at the international level, because the decisions are made on the basis of one country, one vote, just like in the General Assembly of the United Nations, developing countries are the vast majority. And so nothing happens, nothing happens in the international negotiations. That's the UNFCCC, that is not favored by developing countries. And we see that each year, including this year. Countries, this is Utkarsh Bardwaj. I apologize for my very terrible pronunciation of names. Countries like India and China are considered to be the factory of the world and mostly produce goods uh, which does emit greenhouse gases. They are getting the burden of consumption. So how should that be balanced? Well, this is a question that is discussed a lot in the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, whether to use what we refer to as production accounting, where the products are produced, or consumption accounting, attribute the emissions to where they're consumed. Um, and it's an interesting topic. It's an academic topic. I teach about this in my class at Harvard. It has never entered into the discussions in the UNFCCC, the annual conferences of the parties, because of the fact that what can be controlled are the emissions, and the emissions are taking place where the products are produced. So it's very difficult to see how you'd put in place commitments. You'd have to have a place a commitment by the United Kingdom for emissions from China. The other thing I want to alert to you, and I don't know if the slide is available. I use it in teaching. You'll be very surprised to see that if you put in place consumption-based accounting, what the changes in emissions are for different countries. The emissions accounting actually increases for a number of developing countries. Now it decreases tremendously for China and India because because of the amount that they're exporting of their production. And they increased tremendously for the United Kingdom, increased by a very small amount for the US because because so much of consumption is from domestic production. But it does increase for some countries, and the United Kingdom, as I recall, stands out. I mean, I could take time to find the slide, but I'm not sure exactly where it is on my computer, so I won't do that. But it's
Yeah,
an interesting topic. It's
yeah,
just not as obvious.
Stavin, to add in that, if we link it with this carbon adjustment taxes across border, then the problem may
Yeah,
get
well,
more
that's the other
significant.
thing. I'm glad you mentioned that because that's the other thing you should be aware of is that essentially a way to account for that is to put what countries would do. They would put taxes, they'll put tariffs on imports from developing countries of products that were intensive in their production. That's exactly what the CBAM does. And developing countries are very upset about it. They call that, rich country environmental protectionism. And maybe they're right. But that's why thank you so much for having reminded me. It's a very, very important point, is that, if the CBAM, which it looks like in the year 2027, they will begin to collect the fees at the border, it's going to affect exports from a number of developing countries.
But Professor Stavins, but simultaneously, because our objective is also the growth development. For the developing countries, this growth opportunity, they will be missed because their products will be taxed there. So that's the complication in this game.
Well, then the idea is, I don't know what the motivations were of the European Union. To some degree, it was private industry wanted a level playing field. They were worried, European private industry, about losing comparative advantage to countries that faced weaker standards. But it also may be that the European Parliament wanted to encourage other countries to put in place climate policies, because if the climate policy is as stringent as what the European Union has, then there is no border adjustment. And I can tell you a number of countries that I'm working with that are outside of the European Union are doing precisely that. If you have a choice, essentially. If you put in place your own carbon tax of the same level, or your own cap and trade program that's auctioned allowances, then you keep the revenue. If you don't, you hand over the revenue to the European Union. So, that's up to countries to decide. I don't know what the effects will be. I haven't looked at India, but some countries like Vietnam will be very, very significantly affected. I don't think it's going to convince China to change, because China although their exports are huge, their exports are an extremely small share of their production for the products that are being initially regulated. So should I go on to another question?
Yeah, please.
So there's a question about resiliency, and this is, to me, climate resiliency to adaptation. One of the things that happened is that there was so much increased attention to the loss and damage fund that diverted attention away from the adaptation fund. This may be, more detail than you're interested in about international negotiations, but that's what happened, is that much more attention now has gone to the loss and damage fund. Problem with the transfer of technology. So on technology, one way that can happen, and happen effectively, is through foreign direct investment. And that's why, in my mind, Article 6.2 could be so valuable. It really could be extremely valuable, but I'm concerned that it's not going to be used the way it could have. Developed countries are doing business for their own interest. Oh, I think every country works for its own interest. No, that was my point in the very first slide. This is a global commons problem, and every country looks at the direct benefits it gets and the direct costs. The surprising thing is not that some countries are not taking action from an economic perspective. The surprising thing is that the European Union has been as ambitious as it has been. Because it's not clear that it's in its own, welfare interests, at least in the short term. Major emissions are from land use and agriculture sector. What can be done to reduce those emissions, especially in developing countries like India? Well, I'll refer here to methane, and I know this is a very sensitive topic for India. because in India, the methane emissions are largely coming from, or mainly from agriculture, from livestock. Normally for 30 years or more of working on environmental policy, whenever anyone talks about a win-win policy, inferring that there are no costs, I always am extremely skeptical. But there actually, in the case of methane, there are actually win-win policies. And they come in two forms. So one is the oil and gas methane emissions. These are coming from leaks in pipelines, wellheads, and pumps. And if you reduce leakage or you reduce flaring of methane, then you're keeping more of a merchantable product in the pipeline that you can sell, which is why the large oil and gas companies are quite enthusiastic about cooperating to reduce methane emissions. If the cost is low enough, it can actually be profitable to reduce methane emissions. I'm not saying it is for everyone. Now, that's true of the large oil and gas companies, but less, and I mean the really large ones, the multinationals. But more than 50% of the methane emissions are coming from small operations that have 1 to 3 wells. And for them, it can be much more costly. The other area where this is interesting is indeed in agriculture, and in particular in the dairy. So, as you probably know, from livestock, methane emissions come from both ends of the animal and that methane gas. How can that be reduced? Well, the primary way that research is now taking place, both in private industry and in universities, is for reducing emissions from livestock is changing the feed. And so using and there's a tremendous amount of research from the big feed companies and from pharmaceutical companies of feed additives and changes to feed that reduce emissions. Now, what's interesting about that is presumably that feed will be more expensive because it's doing something additional now. But as a result of reducing what's essentially a waste product, it means that you will likely increase the amount of protein produced, whether that's dairy product or it's meat, it's muscle in livestock, and therefore it can actually pay off for farmers. So this is something that's now getting so it can actually be win-win, and that's actually getting a lot of attention now.
But Stavins here means given these small numbers of the entities, so designing policy to make it win-win, that's quite means is like an impossible kind of task in that. No?
Well, I
Technology
wouldn't
is
say
there,
it's
but
impossible. But I mean, but it's much more challenging with the small operators. That's true of every environmental policy that I've worked on for 35 years. Every environmental policy. Larger companies have lower marginal abatement costs than smaller operations. And that's why in the US, the larger companies have often gone along, and then the smaller companies are opposed to the policy. So that's always true. And in areas where there are small operations in developing countries, and agriculture is obviously a great example in India, then it is going to be higher cost. But then in terms of
so that's why given this democratic
operations and
setups,
commercial facilities and manufacturing, if you're looking at China, well, they're very large scale. And so there will be opportunities for, low marginal abatement costs. I agree.
so that's why Stavins here given our democratic setups, so which government would like to take these things on that, given this democratic setup, because these are the small, large numbers. It's very difficult, or you can say the challenging, given our democratic setup. So that's become a
Yeah, well,
political economy problem on that.
I think the way to make any climate policy more
Yes.
feasible is to create local beneficiaries. So a climate policy that reduces CO2 by discouraging coal also has huge human health benefits because of reduced PM 2.5. So that's an example on the direct benefit side. The other one is to put in place a policy that generates revenue for government and then use that revenue for the disadvantaged communities. I mean, that's a way to generate political support in democracies, in my view.
Yeah, that's
So should I go to other
yeah, please,
questions?
please.
Okay. Uh, how can we directly tax pollution so these companies, they cannot shift the incidence to the consumer? Well, that's a good question. Although I agree with the premise that the incidence will be partly on consumers. I'm not sure it's desirable to change that. Um, so it's true that it doesn't matter. This doesn't have to be pollution, any kind of tax. It doesn't matter at what level you place the tax, whether it's on producers or consumers. The way in which the tax burden incident falls is purely 100% a function of supply and demand, market conditions. In other words, the elasticity of supply and the elasticity of demand. Now, the questioner, Deb, would like to insulate consumers from the tax. But it's important that consumers feel the tax because that's why they shift to less carbon intensive products. So trying to shield, and the same desire is in the US, I've seen it in California, but that's not a positive outcome. They should feel the tax. If you want to take some of that revenue and give them money that's independent of the amount of product they use, that's fine. You can compensate them, but they shouldn't be insulated from the policy itself.
Yes.
How can we control use? So I don't have any great thoughts on plastic because it's not to tell the truth, I used to work on lots of environmental problems and have over my career. But for the last 10 years, it seems all of my attention has been going to climate change. So I don't have any great thoughts. So I think I've gone through those questions that there are some questions that I don't know what the answer is. So I
Yeah,
didn't think there's any reason uh, to trying to address those. I guess on the hydrogen, if it's if a carbon tax or a cap and trade system is addressed to the fossil fuels, then you can certainly benefit, hydrogen, even though hydrogen, that is green hydrogen, not so-called blue hydrogen, hydrogen that is not produced from the burning of fossil fuels, hydrogen that's produced from renewables. That it can provide incentives certainly for hydrogen. In the U.S., it's mainly through subsidies because the current administration, the Biden administration, chose not to put in place serious pricing instruments because most politicians don't like to give out costs; they like to give out benefits. So they've essentially put in subsidy policies, which are problematic in lots of ways. But that's what my government has done.
yeah. So thank you so much and for this wonderful talk. And we can say in India about this trading, especially we can say the carbon intensity trading or this green portfolio trading, we have some experience, though this market cannot fully take off, but there is some experience and the results are in favor of that. And recently also government came with these two notifications in this last 6 months, one with respect to carbon intensity trading and this other about this green credit programs. And that way we
Right.
can say these kind of trading policies, of course they can't be the complete solutions, but they will be add on this policy framework along with these other policy solutions in that. So thank you so much from my side, and now I request Dr. Chan Singh to take over the floor. Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you
I
so much.
must thank.
Chan, you
I
are
think you're
muted.
muted.
So I must thank both of you, Professor Surender and Professor Stavins, for this illuminating talk. And because we have heard you, Professor Stavins, so beautiful that you have spoken to us, I'm being a little selfish. You offered that you could talk to us about COP at Dubai, and I was wondering when would you like to volunteer to share more with us on that topic, and then also guide us the way you've done very professional approach that you had today while taking the question answers, the way you guided us through the whole thing. I think it's very, very important, a very large emerging country that we are, and we are contributing significantly to growth. We are now in terms of thinking about 25 years of growth and development, because we are all thinking in terms of 2047 now. So I would really invite you at your convenience to come and tell us more about this, and something that we can learn from your efforts. We will certainly be taking your advice and visiting the websites at Harvard. So happy that the best minds in the world are looking at this. I would like to invite you again. As far as today's event is concerned, we'll be putting it on our website tomorrow by noon. And I'm sure many of us are going to share with other friends, government officials, because the quality of discussion, the presentation as well as the discussion has been extremely high. And I must mention, Professor, your second portion, which you added, the methane part, is very, very new and very, very informative. So one of the reasons I would like to share far and wide would be that additional component that you have added. With that, I would like to just make one closing announcement. The EGROW Foundation is making an effort at economic literacy, similar to financial literacy, and we work on topics every day for 1 hour, 7:30 to 8:30 our talk is there. We work on topics like introduction to macro, 5 hour, every day 1 hour. The module is on a weekly basis on introduction to financial markets, introduction to economic issues in the country, and that is how every month we cycle these 4 programs. I would request you to take advantage, share with your students, share with your colleagues who are far and wide in the country. The speakers are people like my age and who have had the exposure both India and abroad, and at major policy making bodies like the RBI, SEBI, or still teaching at JNU or Delhi University. Those are the type of people who come and speak every evening. So I would like you to take advantage of this economic literacy program, which EGROW is running. With that, let me also thank the participants who have been up and late in a winter night and been with us on a Friday evening, so and made the discussion so lively and contributed to the questions. So Professor Stavins, thanks a lot. Professor Surender, thanks a lot. And see you all next Friday in another talk on climate. Good
Thank you.
night.
So
Have a great weekend.
thank you, Dr. Singh, and thank you, Professor Kumar. I enjoyed it.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much. Yeah. Bye.